I warned you that the McCarthyism was coming for Bernie. I warned you that the Cold War reenactment was coming for Bernie. We saw a Politico article a few weeks ago, basically trying to tie Bernie to Russia. Now, a full spread in the New York Times. Shocker. Mayor and foreign minister. How Bernie Sanders brought the Cold War to Burlington, Vermont. Referendum, rallies, a trip to Nicaragua, all were part of his effort to infuse left-wing activism into local politics. So, not to lecture you, but let me just explain for a second how corporate media works. The New York Times, you don't even have to read the story, which I've read the story. It doesn't even matter what the story says. The New York Times wrote this story for the headline because they want to scare and give a boogeyman to their mostly establishment, older readers. It's the biggest paper in the world, but it is a traditional establishment reader. I don't think the majority of millennials have a New York Times subscription. I'm just guessing. So, and I'm not, no criticism to our viewers because we do have a good amount of older progressives, but I don't think the New York Times main wheelhouse is younger progressives or even older progressives, actual progressives, not the faux progressives like, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. So the New York Times wrote this story pretty much banking on a scary McCarthyite headline and a shaggy old picture, well, younger picture of Bernie from like the 1980s. That's all this story was. Because the majority of people do not read a full story. The majority of people do not even read half a story. The majority of people read a headline and maybe the first paragraph or two. Majority of people don't even read any of it. They just see it on Twitter. And this headline is to scare the living bejesus out of the New York Times reader and to tie Bernie to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the Cold War, to Burlington, Vermont. I am not going to read the whole thing. I'll read a little bit. I hope you've eaten. So, first paragraph. For Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, the summer of 1985 was to be a moment of extraordinary triumph. In July, on the 6th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, Mr. Ortega would address a crowd of hundreds of thousands with a message of defiance for his political nemesis, Ronald Reagan, and the Contra militias waging war on him with support from Washington. Amid the festivities, Mr. Ortega would also meet with the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Who could that be? Bernie Sanders, then 43, journeyed for 14 hours to reach Nicaragua, switching planes in Boston, Miami, and San Salvador, and made a truncated tour of the violence-stricken country before the grand event in Managua. Aspects of the trip might have unsettled another visitor. A reporter who traveled with Mr. Sanders wrote of strict limits on the taking of photographs. At the anniversary celebration, a Wire report described a chant rising up, "Here, there, everywhere, the Yankees will die. The Yankee will die." If Mr. Sanders harbored unease about the Sandinistas, he did not dwell on it. Quote, after many years of economic and political domination, Nicaragua is determined not to be a banana republic anymore, and it's free to make its own decisions, Mr. Sanders declared, according to a Nicaraguan newspaper, El Nuevo Diario, quoting him in Spanish. Is that a crime? Unusual though it was, Mr. Sanders' trip did not shock his constituents. His Nicaraguan odyssey was part of a year-long effort to infuse local politics with international issues, and to transform Burlington, a once sleepy college town on the shores of Lake Champlain, into a haven for left-wing activism in the twilight of the Cold War. Oh, the Cold War. A New York Times review of Mr. Sanders' mayoral papers, including hundreds of speeches, handwritten notes, letters, political pamphlets, and domestic and foreign newspaper clippings from a period spanning nearly a decade, revealed that from his earliest days in office, Mr. Sanders aimed to execute his own foreign policy, repudiating Mr. Reagan's approach of aggressively backing anti-communist governments and resistant forces while going further than many Democrats in supporting socialist leaders. So, right there, the New York Times spent all its time, all its resources in going through Bernie Sanders' old notes and paperwork as a mayor, essentially to try and paint him as not, yeah, America first. That's what this is. They're trying to paint him with a not so subtle brush as supporting communist and socialist uprisings that are opposite of the patriots here in America. And the New York Times and all these establishment idiots in the corporate media, in Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer's little establishment army, they basically try and make it like socialism and communism. It's all the same. They're all commies. This is what this news article is about. It's like the amount of time they spent going through Bernie Sanders' old notes while he was Burlington mayor, basically having sympathy for the people of Nicaragua, who, like the people of Iran, like the people of Cuba, like the people of El Salvador, like the people of many other countries that the United States policies and corruption and military-industrial complex have hurt. God forbid Bernie Sanders had some sympathy for a country who the United States policies has harmed. But do you see it's not even subtle in this piece. I mean, let's read this sentence again. Revealed that from his earliest days in office, Mr. Sanders aimed to execute his own foreign policy, repudiating Mr. Reagan's approach of aggressively backing anti-communist governments and resistant forces, while going further than many Democrats in supporting socialist leaders. So, right here, repudiating Mr. Reagan, a war criminal, by the way, approach of aggressively backing anti-communist governments. Well, with that sentence, you're kind of insinuating that Bernie Sanders backed the pro-communist governments. It's McCarthyism 101. It's propaganda. It's an embarrassment to journalism. And you know what? I actually think it's a strength that Bernie Sanders went to Nicaragua. I actually think it's a strength that Bernie Sanders has a long track record of not only sympathizing, but actively trying to make connections with socialist governments and even communist governments who were not, we're not talking about Stalin communism, but with governments that had basically the same issues we're having in America, but worse, where workers were being displaced, where workers were being starved, where, the means of production, whether it be farming, whether it be mining, whether it be labor, were basically being hijacked by corporate interests, and the workers were getting crumbs. Where people were starving. Where, as a result, crime. God forbid Bernie Sanders went to sympathize with those people or to learn more about those communities. I wish more politicians or mayors would go do that. Go to Venezuela right now, see the truth. Go to Colombia, where the United States, because Colombia is, for our business ties, there's a lot of gold and copper being mined there, and the United States wants some of that gold and copper. The United States looked the other way as the brutal maniac leader of Colombia, Ben Norton, has done some great reporting from there, just executes labor leaders, executes social movement leaders opposing the brutality of the Colombian government. The United States looks the other way. But we care about the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Well, Venezuela is blocking us from their oil, so yeah, we care very much about that humanitarian crisis. Not so much about the Colombian crisis. Or let's say, we love Brazil, who has a maniac, homophobic leader, because he's good for our business interests. Same thing goes with Saudi Arabia. God forbid Bernie Sanders supported socialist governments. I'll read you a little bit more. I can't stomach much more. Mr. Sanders' activities during his mayoralty bring into relief the fervently anti-imperialist worldview that continues to guide him. They also underscore his combative ideological persona, which has roiled national democratic politics as thoroughly as it has upended municipal government in Burlington. As a mayor, Mr. Sanders denounced decades of American foreign policy that he portrayed as guided by corporate greed and outlined a vision of international affairs defined by disgust at military spending and sympathy for Marxist-inspired movements in the developing world. Oh my God, why don't you just put a commie stamp on his forehead and call it a day, the New York Times. Now, as he competes for the Democratic presidential nomination, Mr. Sanders' profound skepticism of American power appears to set him apart from other major candidates who have pledged to restore the country's traditionally assertive global role. Mr. Sanders' signature foreign policy issue so far has been his opposition to American support for Saudi Arabia's brutal war in Yemen. Let me just, if I had a whiteout, I would just say, instead of brutal war, Saudi Arabia's genocide in Yemen. We'll wipe that out in post-production of this live stream, even though it's not a live stream. Brutal war in Yemen, which has inflicted vast civilian suffering, and he has resisted endorsing regime change in Venezuela, where the Trump administration has been pressuring Nicolas Maduro, a leftist dictator, to leave power. Oh my God, the propaganda. Did the New York Times forget, like, is it not in the Associated Press, like, you know, the AP style guideline, when you're writing of a world leader to actually put in his title? It's pressuring Nicolas Maduro, a leftist dictator, to leave power. Whether you like it or not, he's the president of Venezuela. But the New York Times is, of course, an arm of the CIA and the deep state, which, yes, there's a deep state. Mr. Sanders' deep-rooted foreign policy values have the potential to not only earn him support from voters who have grown tired of overseas wars, but also make him vulnerable to attack from rivals in both parties who are eager to depict him as too radical for the presidency. This right here, I just want to give you the behind the scenes of corporate media. This right here is the corporate media and the New York Times way of giving its own opinion without actually having it be formally its own opinion. So the New York Times, what they're doing here is saying Bernie Sanders is too radical for the presidency. But they're not quoting anybody saying it so that they could give their own opinion. They say, well, it could earn him support from voters who have grown tired of overseas wars, but also make him vulnerable to attacks from rivals, aka the New York Times. And this is where they give their own opinion, clouded as just a hypothesis. It could make him vulnerable to attacks from rivals in both parties who are eager to depict him as too radical for the presidency. This is how corporate media works. This is their own opinion hidden in it could make him more vulnerable to attacks from rivals like us. Mr. Sanders declined an interview for this article, which he should have because it's not a news story. It is propaganda. And don't want to brag, but pretty happy to report to you, Jane Sanders agrees. And this is what Jane Sanders said in response to my tweet. I tweeted out, just like I warned Status Quo viewers, this is now the second propaganda piece by corporate media trying to stoke McCarthyism against Bernie Sanders. Its goal is for the headline to spook readers into thinking Sanders admires communism. And knowing, it gets cut off. And knowing that most people just read the headline. So Jane Sanders responded to my tweet. Thank you, Mrs. Sanders, potentially the First Lady. Along with false foreign policy impression, they imply he paid no attention to municipal matters in Burlington. He doubled voter turnout in Burlington, Vermont, won by increasing margins four times, and was named one of the best 20 mayors in America by that radical publication, U.S. News and World Report! Exclamation point. I wish I had a buzzer or something to cheer Jane Sanders. I mean, I really hope Bernie's campaign, I know what they're doing, and they're really focused on, you know, each week trying to put out a new policy. Just today, he put out a policy that as president, he would basically outlaw for-profit charter schools, which I'm in agreement with. And Bernie Sanders, you think they're against him now? You wait till Betsy DeVos gets her hands on him. Well, not literally. You wait till all the private foundations for the people that are helping the people that are invested heavily in these charter schools. Oh, Bernie's going after the charter schools and Big Pharma? God, that's risky business, but why not? It's true. I mean, I don't have the time to get fully into charter schools, but most of them are scams. Most of them are not to help lift, the vulnerable and the impoverished out of poverty and give them an education they wouldn't normally get. No, they're not. When there's profit involved, like in healthcare and education, there's greed and false motives and ulterior motives. But as Jane Sanders said, I hope Bernie's campaign comes out and starts going at the New York Times and others, because I told you in the first place a few weeks ago, you just wait. You just wait for them to, drape this growing McCarthyism around Bernie Sanders, because that's their best bet. The truth is, if Bernie Sanders is going to win this nomination, he can't just do it with his existing base of progressives. He has to expand the black vote, which he did not do great in 2016. I'm just keeping it real. He did better he did win millennial black voters, but he needs to do better with older black voters. And he also needs to do better, just period, with older voters, 50 plus, which gravitated to Hillary Clinton. And in most of the polls, even though they're oversampling older voters and undersampling younger voters, which we've reported on extensively here, in the sampling of older voters are going to Joe Biden right now. Bernie Sanders threatens the New York Times investors' interests. Bernie Sanders threatens the New York Times readership, who a lot of the New York Times readership is wealthier people. And the New York Times is run by people that live in an ivory tower, New York and DC bubble. They don't like Bernie. Radical.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.